Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. It is a pleasure to be back with you again this week, and some news to start the Climate of Sport podcast off is that we have made it to the long list for the sport category in the British Podcast Awards. Now, don't get too excited, it's a long list. And some of the other podcasts that have been longlisted are absolute behemoths. We're talking the BBC's Formula One podcast, Checkered Flag, their grassroots podcast, Games Gone with Steve Bracknell, the Guardian's Football Weekly podcast, Stuart Broad's For the Love of Cricket Award, Matchroom Boxing's pod, Man United legends, and British comedian Paddy McGuinness's podcast, The Good, the Bad, and the Football, as well as the Peter Crouch podcast. So we are being longlisted for a category full of basically athletes, celebrities, and major news outlets. The shortlist is going to be announced on the 23rd of July. Are we going to be on it? Let's see. But obviously, for us, it's a massive win to be longlisted because it means that climate action in sport is being spoken about in the same sphere as some of these other podcasts, which are really entertainment led. And obviously, we talk a lot about, whilst supporting progress in the industry, like making sure we don't become an echo chamber and getting this messaging out to a wider audience. So in that respect, getting onto this long list is really cool, and we'll share a little bit about it. And please do share if you're a listener of the pod. And the sort of accolade of even being included in that is down to so many of our amazing guests over the year, you all for listening and for sharing your thoughts and your questions in our Ask Me Anything series that we did last year, and all of the amazing guests we've had. So a shout out to everyone on that. They did also say there's this thing this year called the Listener's Choice Award powered by Spotify. And any podcast that is available on Spotify can be put forward for the Listener's Choice Award. If you could nominate the Climate of Sport podcast, that would be amazing. We're going to put out some comms and see if we can mobilise the sport and climate community to get behind it. Again, of course, it would be wonderful for us to have more listeners to the pod. But the main reason we do this, and the main reason we would love to be part of that Listener's Choice Award, is that it would mean that climate change, climate action, sustainability in sport is being spoken about and is being platformed, and awareness is being raised. So, can we get on the list of the Listener's Choice Award? Let's see. But we may as well try, because everything this year for me is about saying yes and trying. And if we fail, that's cool, but we'll have tried. So help us out, raise awareness of climate action in sport through doing this in a whole new sphere. So that's our little intro this week. We are experiencing another heat wave in London, as many people are in Europe, in North America, and in other parts of the world as well. We have had a lot of extreme heat already this year, and it's horrible. I'm not built for it. I don't know how you're all dealing with it. I said in our newsletter, The Brief, this week, please send some cool air if you are somewhere in the world where it's cold right now, because we really need it. So onwards to the climate hat trick. Okay, our first story is about the CEO of a Tour de France team, EF, spending a lot of time thinking about heat. Okay, this is a quote from Jonathan Yorters. He said, in our sports science group, starting last October, I would say 30% of every meeting we had was talking about heat dissipation strategy. And there's an article that talks about how much they are thinking and talking about heat. A third of the time in their sports science meetings. Of course, they are trying to maximize their chance of winning. Absolutely fine. But for me, this piqued my interest because hearing a team principal talk extensively about heat, how they're adapting to it, how they're supporting their riders, how they're thinking about it, is an acknowledgement of our reality, which can be underplayed by leaders in sport. And we sort of get why. This is why it really, really stood out to me, because if you've been watching the FIFA Men's World Cup, obviously there's been unending articles about the hydration breaks and talk of the heat. And what we hear a lot of the time, especially from managers, are refrains around, we're taking it in our stride. Of course, they're projecting resilience and they're projecting control. They're saying things like, well, it's the same for both teams, and these sorts of things. And listen, psychologically, we totally get that. They're not complaining. They don't want to make excuses for performance. And they don't want also to let the competition know they're concerned or they're worried. Because, of course, there are mind games ahead of football matches, and you don't want to give the other team an advantage. So we get it. Argentina manager Lionel Scaloni said adapting to different conditions is part of football, which is true. Like, we get that, we understand that. But it also skates over the conversation of extreme conditions that athletes now face. And of course, elite athletes and all athletes adapting is something they've always had to do, whether it's at altitude or whether it's indoor or outdoor. There's lots of different variations. We get that. But also, we have to acknowledge that this is not normal. The temperatures in which, for example, the Tour de France, Wimbledon this week, the FIFA Men's World Cup, it's not normal in terms of adapting to this. So I'm not throwing shade at any of the managers because I get it from a psychological perspective, what they're doing and why. But back to the Tour de France, that's why this stood out to me about, in this particular article, how much actually Yortas was talking about how they're thinking about heat. This obviously is time in their meetings that's really, really well spent, because the Tour de France is expecting temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius this week, 104 Fahrenheit. Organisers have said they're prepared to adjust routes day by day, and stages may potentially be cancelled if a red heatwave alert is issued. So we've seen riders using adaptations to deal with that extreme heat, from wearing frozen vests, immersing their arms in iced water before stages. They've been freezing their carbo gels used for the dual effect of cooling and fueling, using fans to spray water on riders. They're using ice socks, etc. as well. So we are seeing all of this happen because they are competing in unbelievable temperatures. So the stage 3 winner, Tadej Pogačar, described the heat as a logistical nightmare because as a team, they need to bring water and ice to the riders. So he said, sometimes the valley is long, 15 kilometers, and 3 guys go to the back to the car to take the bottles and ice and keep cooling yourself. It makes a big, big difference. So again, to the football manager's perspective, every team has to deal with this, but it does make a difference to performance, to times, and to the conditioning of the athletes as well. Researchers in France, Spain, and the UK published a piece earlier this year called The Future of European Outdoor Summer Sports Through the Lens of 50 Years of the Tour de France. They researched the wet bulb globe temperature. For those who aren't aware, the wet bulb globe temperature takes into account more than just the air temperature. It also takes into account humidity and how it feels, not just what the exact temperature is. And they researched that for July in Paris, in Nîmes, in Bordeaux, in Toulouse, in Alpe d'Huez, and in the Col de Tourmalet. So for 5 of the 6 locations, the highest wet bulb globe temperature occurrences at 3 o'clock in the afternoon since 1974 have all been recorded since 2018, showing that more instances have happened in the last 8 to 9 years. So we are seeing, of course, due to human-induced climate change, we are seeing a higher instance of these higher temperatures. The outcomes of the research are that the magnitude and occurrences of high heat stress have increased over the recent decade, including in certain areas around Toulouse, Pau, and Bordeaux in France's southwest, and also around Perpignan and Nîmes as well. So there has been a history of high stress heat episodes in these areas. So the research says extra caution should be exercised when planning the events in these particular regions. Planning the race for the morning hours and avoiding afternoon heat could substantially increase rider and spectator safety. Now, as well as the extreme heat that this study raised awareness of and that we're hearing from team bosses as well, tour organisers told fans to stay away this week during stage 3 because of wildfire-related health and safety concerns. So again, exacerbating the heat, but also the health and safety for those who usually line the course to cheer on the riders of Tour de France. And obviously the wildfires have been particularly bad because of the premature May heat wave that we had in Europe, and then another one in June as well that have shattered record temperatures across Western Europe. The World Weather Attribution Group, which is the group who attributes whether certain events could have happened with or without climate change, or how much more likely they are because of the climate crisis, the group of scientists over there said the extreme temperatures recorded in June would have been virtually impossible without the climate crisis. The rider that we quoted before, Tadej Pogačar, said 5 years ago it was totally different than what we have to do now. So the riders are feeling it, the teams are feeling it, the bosses are trying to adapt to it, and we're talking about it more. guess to finish off, what I think as I research and I read and I think about all the things that are happening in sport and how it's being impacted by the climate crisis, this one again particularly stood out to me because, like, what more can we say here for someone who is not a cyclist looking at this from the outside? What I'm seeing genuinely is groups of people cycling up steep inclines, basically, for hours with fires burning and with inescapable extreme heat. And it just makes me think, is this the Tour de France? Is this purgatory? Or is this actually just hell? Because all of this landscape put together, these athletes at the top of their game, at the most peak of their physical condition in this competition, when you take a step back, it is mind boggling what is happening in our world. So, something to think about there. And our second story kind of leads on to this a bit more, but in a completely different way. Our next story is a quote: a whole night spent vomiting, lying on the floor. So this is what Ginevra Taducci, who was the 2024 Olympic bronze medalist in the women's 10K, said after the Open Water World Cup in Portugal at the end of June. She wrote on Instagram, "Dear World Aquatics, we've been facing problems of poor water quality in competitions for years. Where is the protection for athletes?" And she wasn't the only one who took to social media around the same refrain. Water quality is an issue, water temperatures is an issue, and nothing ever really changed. 10 plus athletes sick, some in hospital, said Greg Paltrinieri. So again, this particular Open Water World Cup stop in Portugal seems to have caused no end of issues, because Hungarian Olympic swimmer Betty Fabian was also hospitalised a few hours after returning home from the World Cup and spent 7 hours receiving different treatments in hospitals. She shared she hasn't been that sick since competing in the Seine at Paris 2024 at the Olympic Games. Speaking of, in spite of very high profile issues with the water quality at the last Olympics in Paris in 2024, some of you might remember they had their swimming events in the Seine, but there was a lot of pushback against the quality of the water in the Seine, and the triathlon was pushed back, but did eventually take place, with a lot of coverage about the fact that swimming was taking place in the Seine. In spite of that, several key events at the 2026 European Aquatics Championship, which is taking place later this month, July 31st to August 16th, will again take place in the Seine, but not everyone is going to be there for it. So Fabienne, who had been hospitalised after the Open Water Championship in Portugal, said in a quote on social media, "After my experience there, the infection that I suffered and what has happened to me now, I will not risk my health again. I will not be racing in the Seine." So athletes, again, taking care, advocating for themselves, and in this case, perhaps missing opportunities at really important races because of the environmental conditions. And again, we know this is not saying that governing bodies have it easy and they don't care. It's a complex issue. But I think what we want to say through raising awareness of these stories is that athletes are being impacted. They are elite athletes, they are at the top of their game, but they are human beings. And we're thinking about what impact this is having on them now, let alone in the long term in terms of their health. So again, isn't this more a water pollution issue? Well, this is a podcast about climate action and environmental sustainability. But of course, pollution is the main cause of poor water quality, but the climate crisis is making it worse. So rising temperatures, extreme levels of rainfall, and then the opposite end of the scale, droughts, all of that can intensify the concentration and spread of contaminants. So increased runoff and floods can overwhelm sewage systems, which then flushes agricultural and urban pollutants directly into our lakes, rivers, and oceans. So yes, there's a pollution issue there. It's being exacerbated by climate change. It's not the governing body's fault, but like we've seen with the Clean Water Sports Alliance here in the UK, where governing bodies have come together to advocate and to speak to governments about trying to clean up our waterways so they're safe for recreational swimming or sports. Could governing bodies at a world level take more action around this? It's a really interesting question, and something that I think athletes now and swimmers are definitely asking for. Okay, our final story in the climate hat trick this week is one for UFO hunters. Did you expect to be hearing that? Probably not. If you are a UFO hunter, close your ears because when it comes to Germany's Olympic bids, their environmental minister has said they are not up for UFOs. Okay, I need to say more, right? Sustainability, equal access to nature, and urban legacy are the three focus areas for Germany's Olympic Games bids for 2036, 2040, or 2044, depending on which of the games they bid for. And that is according to their federal environmental minister. So Carsten Schneider has basically said this idea of credible and long-term planning is absolutely critical to any games bids that they put forward for future years. And he said anything else would be just a UFO that lands here for a few weeks and then moves on, which is a great quote. Basically inferring that if the bids don't include sustainability, equal access to nature, and some kind of urban legacy, they are essentially just hosting an unidentified flying object in their region for a couple of weeks, 4 weeks, including the Paralympic Games, and then it heads off again. And that is not what they are looking for. So I love to read this because when I was reading the new strategic direction from the International Olympic Committee, Fit for the Future, which obviously is now under the new boss of the IOC, Kirsty Coventry, at the moment, there's no mention of climate action in that document. That's not to say it's not going to come. In Agenda 2020 plus 5, there was a huge section focused on climate action and environmental sustainability. And some of the content in that area related to 2030 goals. So we can presume that they still stand. But it was interesting to note that in the strategic direction that there isn't any mention yet of climate action. So I thought, let me do a little bit of more of a deep dive. In the 2020 plus 5 document, there were 18 mentions of climate. So that's our baseline in terms of the document. But don't forget, that was the full publicised document, and the Fit for the Future is a webpage around the big strategic direction areas. So hopefully there is more to come. But 18 mentions of climate is our base in terms of what we're thinking. No mentions in Fit for the Future. There is mentions of sustain, so maybe sustainable, sustainability, sustaining, these sorts of words. There are 13 mentions in that context, but all of them seem to relate to financial sustainability, sustainable growth, sustainable participation, and making engagement more sustainable. So I took a step back and thought, okay, there's no climate and there's no sustainability, but things are changing in our sector. We are now using different words to describe our activity. So I went and thought, what else could we look for in this? Nature, for example. Again, thinking about Carsten Schneider, Germany's federal environmental minister, in his quote, he's talking about access to nature and sustainability. So I went back in, no mentions of nature. Resilience is another word we're hearing a lot more. Risk and resilience and how we can become more resilient to the climate crisis. No mentions of resilient or resilience even. Positive and positive impacts. There are 4 mentions of that, but it's all pretty general good stuff, like wanting athletes to have a positive impact on the world around them. That, of course, could include climate action, but it's not specific in nature. Impact was the big winner with 31 mentions. And of course, when we think about impact, there can be positive environmental impact, there can be positive climate impact, but again, it's not specific. None of the mentions of that in context tend to make me think, oh, they're talking about environmental impact or environmental action in that way. So that's where we are with that. I think it's interesting to know. I think there's more to come there, but I just wonder, given what I read this week about Germany's environmental minister and his talk about his focus areas for future bids, how that reflects the overall IOC. They have, of course, led on sustainability in terms of their Sustainability Essentials report. They're putting it into the games, and we've had a lot more sustainable games coming through in Paris. Another Milan Cortina, a lot of sustainability initiatives there. So not to say it's going away, but it's just important to know, let's draw a line in the sand and see what comes next on that. So our big 3 climate hat-trick articles for this week. 1, the CEO of the Tour de France team is spending a lot of time thinking about heat, which is good news. Our second story is Ginevra Taducci saying a whole night spent vomiting, lying on the floor, talking about water quality issues at the recent Open in Portugal. And our last climate hat-trick story is UFO hunters. Close your ears when it comes to Germany's Olympic bids. Their environmental minister is not up for UFOs. So that's all from the climate of sport this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope we've raised awareness of some stories that maybe you haven't caught elsewhere. We will be back next week. We are going to have a special episode next week. I am out having a little 1 week holiday up to the Yorkshire Dales. So there's not going to be a climate hat trick next week, but you are going to hear a special interview recorded with athletes during London Climate Action Week. So look forward to that. And I look forward to being back with you the week